Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to what mediators need to know about mental health. This will be a kind of springboard, I hope, some principles to take away that will encourage you as mediators, whatever your practice, to feel confident that the mediation that you're offering will meet the needs of people with mental health conditions or mental ill health. I'm a mediator. I specialize in mental health. I work particularly in the public services sector. I'm also a mental health first aid instructor. So I've taught a few hundred people to be mental health first aiders and taught some 2,000 people about workplace mental health in the last year or so of COVID. So mediation and mental health are really where my passions sort of overlap, and I will tell you more about why that is shortly. So in today's session, my hope is really that you will feel better equipped to undertake mediation cases where mental health might be a factor, that you'll feel confident to respond safely and appropriately to a client showing signs of distress in mediation, that you'll know how to identify and mitigate a crisis of mental health in a client, but also have an understanding of where a mental health concern may mean that a mediation shouldn't proceed or start. We'll learn a little bit about the Equality Act 2010 and reasonable adjustments. And we'll be thinking about how to respond to a referrer or another party making assumptions about someone else's mental health. And really important, we'll explore through this, by implication, how to look after your own well-being as a mediator, particularly if you have been supporting a client in distress. So working together, we're here on Zoom. So those of you here on the live session will generally keep mics off. It's lovely to have cameras on if you feel comfortable. If you're on grid view, then you get to shimmy across my slide to make it smaller and see more people, or vice versa. And we'll use the chat box. You can communicate with me directly or to everyone. All questions are welcome. You can wave or use the raise hand function. As discussed, we're recording today's taught sections. Don't feel you need to take masses of notes, because I'm going to send out these slides to you with hyperlinks in, and now we've got this recording, I'll make it available to you as well. But it might be helpful for you to have paper just to note down a few things in exercises. We'll seek to respect and explore each other's views and opinions, really taking on board that we're all learning about mental health collectively. None of us have all the answers, and we all come here with different experiences, different lived experience. Confidentiality will be familiar to everyone here as mediators, so everything discussed here stays here. And I just want to ask you to think about looking after yourself in this session. We will be touching on some sensitive subjects, particularly just towards the end of the session. And sometimes those can bring up distressing feelings. And sometimes that can be a surprise for us as well. So just keep checking in with yourself. And if actually things are touching for you, then just take a break. We're going to go through without a break, but if you need a break at any time, just turn your camera off and be comfortable. And most of all, I hope that you'll feel you can enjoy the session. So we've got 6 key messages that we're going to be working with today. Number 1, it is all about the chicken and the egg of conflict and mental ill health. Number 2, we all have mental health, and there is no health without mental health. Number 3, the mediation process is pre-designed to be accessible to people with mental health conditions. And that's a really important thing I want you to sort of to feel comfortable with. As I think it was Victoria said, you know, actually, this is a really valuable listening space, and there are things we can do just to adjust, which is normal to mediation. It's flexible. Number 4, it helps to keep the brain in mind. I'm going to share some of my lay neuroscience for you. Number 5, it's okay to ask, and I'll explain what that means. And number 6, put on your own oxygen mask first. So please remember, anything we're looking at today, it's for you as well. sometimes our work is really exhausting or distressing. So having patterns of things we can do for our own mental well-being is really valuable. So what I'd like you to do now is just use the chat box to introduce yourselves. So just briefly, your name and your pronouns if you wish, your areas of mediation practice or your connection to mediation, whatever you would like to say. And then, most importantly, I'd like you to share one good thing that's happened to you in the last week. One good thing that's happened to you in the last week. And that might be something that was exciting and stimulating or nourishing or relief to you. It might be something you did by yourself or with others, something planned or spontaneous. Okay, so we'll just take a moment to introduce ourselves. And what I will do is I will just be reading out the one good things, but I won't identify. So have a think about what your one good thing might be. Great, I can see them starting to come in, which is wonderful. Thank you. So, lovely. One person says, a nice walk in the countryside. Yes, absolutely. Being outside and being in nature and also moving the body. So one of the things that we don't talk enough about in mental health generally is how much the body kind of holds our distress. There's an amazing book called The Body Holds the Score, which really underlines how important it is for us to move to process our feelings. Someone else says, a chat with a new friend, lovely, that's great. And a great evening at an open air comedy show last night, great to be with a crowd and laugh. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that, that's gorgeous. Great, good thing. I went to the Savoy last night, invited to be there as being a community mediator and got drunk on champagne. That is the happiest thing I've had in a while. That's lovely. And someone else has been participating in the Cedar Storython, which just sounds as though it's been amazing today. I think it's today, isn't it? And have connected with colleagues across the world who I haven't seen for ages. Gorgeous. And for those of you who are watching the recording, just so you know, we've got a mixture of commercial, workplace and employment mediation, community mediation, workplace, all sorts, including a beginner mediator. A warm welcome to you. Great. Okay, so I'll let those keep coming in. And I am going to draw together your good things, because in sharing our good things, we have really done our first lesson in mental health. We've got another one here. Swing dancing with friends last night with a 3-day swing festival this weekend. Oh my gosh, what heaven. Spent time with family, said someone else. Wonderful. Well, think of your one good thing and compare it, sort of map it against these 5 ways to well-being. So the 5 ways to well-being were the result of a huge piece of research by the New Economics Foundation that asked, what is it that actually supports mental health and well-being? And they look really simple, but have a think about how many of those buttons were pressed by your one good thing. Being with others, or being active, dancing, giving of your time, or taking notice of something good in your environment, or learning something new. This is actually what makes for good mental health and well-being. And think how much this was impacted by COVID, by this global pandemic that we've just had, how much that underlines. If we can't connect, if we can't be active, if we're not able to give to those who we love, or go out, enjoy, take notice of the things like museums or a film in a cinema, or do the learning that we might have enjoyed, things are really restricted. But how much we valued connecting with others or being active, taking that 1 hour to go and do our walk outside. giving of our time to support a neighbor, for example, or think of, people who started planting their gardens and then that joy of noticing the plants, the first shoots coming up, or keeping learning, so many people decided to learn how to bake sourdough. These are the things that make us tick. And what can happen when we're in conflict is that those things drop away. They're not so important. They're not the priority, because our dispute becomes the priority. But also, and we'll talk about this chicken and egg, sometimes it can be that it's just a mixture of these things have dropped out of our lives. Our mood has really dropped. We felt disconnected, and then we can be more vulnerable to conflict. So here are the 5 ways to well-being. And I think talking about those and having an audit for yourself is a really good way of talking about mental health. Are there ways that you can connect with others? Is a question that will prompt a party or client to think about the support network they might need. Or sometimes it's really good to go and have a walk. Do you want to, maybe have a walk after our meeting and just process it? That's a suggestion for self-care without us ever talking about their mental health. So let's ask ourselves now, and I'm going to suggest that we go into breakout rooms just for a few minutes. This question I suggested you might want to have a think about in advance. What are the challenges for and opportunities available to mediators working with clients who may have mental health needs? And I put in the little box, consider how you might respond if a mediation commissioner or party says, we think there are mental health issues with this person, which is a common occurrence. So that's why I really put that sort of asterisk by the word may, because we may never know. And as we'll see, as mediators, the likelihood is we will never need to know. Our processes are psychologically safe enough and inclusive enough that we are not going to need to ask someone to disclose their mental health condition for them to be able to access mediation with us. Okay, so we'll have a couple of breakout rooms, and and of course everything is optional. So if you're not feeling like going into a breakout room, just stay out. And I'm going to pause the recording now while we just arrange that. So thanks everyone. We've had such a great conversation about those opportunities and the challenges, and I've so loved the sort of positivity of everyone involved in terms of this sort of can-do approach about what we can do as mediators to meet the needs of anyone that might be involved in mediation. So let's take ourselves through some of these key messages now, and I'm going to share a little bit about what brings me to this work as well. So I say it's all about the chicken and the egg of conflict and mental ill health. And a note on terminology. People can get concerned about the right terminology, and maybe we just start here. Some people will say you can't say mental health problems or difficulties or issues. And within Mind, for example, there's been quite a lot of research on what people with lived experience of mental ill health use themselves, and they often say we use the terms mental health problems, issues, and difficulties. So that's part of the mix of the language, and it's important, I think, for us not to kind of sort of have aspects of language that we would want to criticize others for. But we do talk about mental health or poor mental health as a general experience, slightly different to a mental health condition, which may have a diagnosis or be diagnosable. So just, always kind of, my feeling is when we're talking with someone who may be experiencing mental ill health is to check in with what language they like and for us to be flexible. So when I say the chicken and egg of conflict and mental ill health, I mean, what causes what? We sometimes think, oh, we can't deal with a conflict until we've dealt with the mental health. And I think we have to approach both together. So everyone is, or many of us will be familiar with the various different conflict styles. And often people will come to us because they have either an avoiding or an accommodating conflict style, or maybe a competing conflict style. And I think what's important to understand is that many of us have grown up without the skills for resolving conflict. And resolving conflict, if it's compromising and collaborating and being assertive, we have a foundation that we need for that. good communication skills, self-esteem, and to feel comfortable with setting healthy boundaries. Many of us grew up without those skills. And actually, not only does it lead to conflict, but it can really lead to not having those skills, not being able, for example, to set healthy boundaries around our needs, can lead to traumatic experiences. And for many people, by the time they come to us, they've had many traumatic experiences around, for example, trying to express their voice or assert boundaries, or feeling they couldn't ask for what they need because of worrying about repercussions. Maybe in the past that was met with aggressive or abusive responses. So not being able to use our voice can be a foundation for mental health difficulties in later life. And through my journey, I have come to see that that played a real part for me as well. There's a lovely quote here by William Ury, who says, the tension is between exercising your voice and tending to your relationship. So if our early relationships were all very precarious, then we were less likely to exercise our voice. So for me, as mediators, what we are doing is helping to give voice in a safe environment. For many people who are not practiced at that, what their associations are traumatic. Equally, we're all wired differently. So this is where I start to talk a little bit about myself. So I come to this work really through, 3 decades of having support for my mental health at a professional level. So as a teenager when I first had mental health support. And it's really sort of been throughout my life, and with, you know, sometimes really quite acute periods. And one of the big things that really helped me was some years ago, I guess 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with autism. And I mention this because I know that when people come to me to talk about mental health, they also want to know about neurodiversity as well. And I think it can be said that those of us who are neurodivergent can, in some instances, be more vulnerable to mental ill health and even more vulnerable to conflict because of various factors, which is maybe for another session. But what I want to share for you here is an fMRI scan of 2 people. On the right, we have what we might call a neurotypical brain. There's got some good thought going on there. And on the left, we've got the brain of an amazing woman called Temple Grandin. She is an engineer of international standing, and she is also one of the best speakers on Asperger's and autism in the world. And this is her brain. So when I was diagnosed with autism and I saw her brain, I thought, oh my gosh, well, maybe that's just all genius, that bright light and all of that activity going on there. And to some extent, for many of us, our neurodivergent wiring can give some real insight and real empathy. But also what we're seeing here is a lot of trying to make connections, a lot of battery burn in the brain, and a lot of sensitivity to stimulus, high arousal. And often we're processing a great deal of information at the same time, and it can be quite difficult to express ourselves, to know what's going on with someone else. And you often get a lot of masking and a lot of burnout underneath all of that. So that had helped me understand why I had experienced anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, postnatal depression as well, was part of the whole package of who I am. But really things came to a head for me when I was in, it was around 2015. So I mentioned this theme of voice. You know, for many years I'd struggled to express my voice, and really this had led to quite a lot of traumatic experiences. And for me, that led to me being reluctant to negotiate for myself. And there's an understanding within how the brain works. We can be in fight or flight, but equally when there's some alert mixed with trauma, we can really retract. It's known as fawning, which can be sort of like people pleasing or accommodating. And in a sense, that was my conflict management style, but it didn't deal with conflicts as life got more complex. So around 2015, I was experiencing conflict avoidant me experiencing conflicts with a business partner, a consultancy client, my daughter's school, my neighbors. I mean, I just had a complete confluence of conflicts. They spiraled and escalated, and the impact on my mental health was that I went into a huge mental health breakdown. And it was one day I was sort of okay, and the next I left my workplace, got in my car and just drove away as far as I could go, which was literally until I reached the sea. And those of you in the West Country will know that largely that means you end up at Weston-super-Mare. So hence this image here. I was there standing on the beach thinking I probably need a couple of days off just to sort of sort my head out. I was working as a management consultant at the time, so it was quite high pressure. I was aware of that, but 2 days turned into 2 weeks, turned into 2 years before I could work again, and 4 years until I could work full time. I wished I'd had support to be able to express my voice. Anyway, I felt I wanted it to be this experience, the kind of the real learning experience. I didn't want my whole life to be defined by this. And I had an amazing GP who offered to work with me. I'd been on and off medication and was currently off medication. And she said, just a trigger warning here for you, just to let you know, I was experiencing severe suicidal ideation, and bless her, she was prepared to work with me to find ways that would be sustainable. We had an agreement. If I felt I was at a risk to myself, I would phone her or 999. So one of the things she did was refer me to social prescribing, which is basically an amazing, relatively new thing where we get connected to things that help us connect to ourselves again. And it was such a success that I ended up becoming a bit of a poster girl for social prescribing. So my darling dad had always wanted me to see me featured in the Financial Times. Here I was. Let me read it to you. When Arabella Tresilian, a management consultant, suffered a mental breakdown in 2015, her doctor recognized that her autism had combined with other events to cause post-traumatic stress disorder and chronic fatigue. Ms. Tresilian did not want to return to the antidepressants she had taken on and off over the previous 27 years. Luckily, her doctor's surgery offers social prescribing, patient referral, etc. And yes, I did do some of these kind of uplifting things, but really what the social prescriber helped me do was identify what I needed and help me find ways to ask for it. Now, isn't that what we do as mediators? We help people identify what it is that they need, and they help them ask for it. So this really took off. And if, finding my voice was the kind of the key thing for me. My goodness, in this kind of being sort of speaking up around social prescribing, my Lord, I found my voice and ended up speaking for the King's Fund, Public Health England. I was on the radio, and another high moment for my father, The Sun, page 5, and I even was invited to meet Prince Charles. So I found my voice really talking about mental health, and part of that journey was training as a mediator. I didn't want other people to experience just everything falling apart and people kind of saying, well, have you thought about this or thought about that? I needed people to walk a journey with me. And yeah, it sort of finished the story. Last year, I was invited to speak for the CMC annual conference on mental health. And that was just really amazing, just amazing. And I think this is what the work we're doing is all about. It's finding voice. So mental health, often we get worried about the topic and we think, oh my gosh, am I qualified? And I don't want to do any harm. I don't want to make it worse. So I want to kind of reassure you a little bit here. We all have mental health, and there is no health without mental health. And I've even given you a government recommended resource there. So what is mental health? Well, the World Health Organization defines it as a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, and can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her own community. So this is what any of us would want for ourselves. Let's look into this a little bit more. I heard someone in one of the groups mention it's a spectrum, and a word we tend to use in mental health first aid is the word continuum. And I'm going to take you through it. So first of all, we have this recognition that any of us will at any time either be spiraling up to a slightly better mental well-being or fitness, or maybe we'll be sliding down. It's very rare that we're absolutely constant, steady state. So think very gently of a time where you felt maybe at a lower mental state of mental well-being and fitness. And just think about how you felt and the circumstances. Again, just being gentle with yourself, how it impacted your life, your ability to communicate. And then I want you to shake that off, take a deep breath, and think of a time where you've been at your maximum mental well-being and fitness. Think about your face, how everything felt to you, how easy it was to communicate, and so on. We all have mental health, and it all changes the whole time. Yeah. So often where we get stuck is with the medical model, which says mental health is like you're either okay or you've got a mental health problem, a diagnosis or no diagnosis. So we want to mix that up a bit. This framework gives us some helpful pointers, because if we look at them as quadrants, we can see the first quadrant, we've got a person with no mental illness or disorder and positive mental health. It's where we all want to be, and at times maybe we are. Quadrant 2, a person with no diagnosed mental illness or disorder, but who has poor mental health. So if we're struggling, we're feeling anxious about stuff, we're not thriving, we're not coping, or maybe we have burnout, we're in quadrant 2 at that moment. And I think this is the bit that's often misunderstood, particularly within the workplace. In quadrant 3, we have a person with a diagnosis of a serious mental illness and who has poor mental health. And I want to change that, because actually some 75% of people with a diagnosable mental health condition will never get a diagnosis. Okay, so if we've got concerns about diagnosis, we've got to chuck them out of the window, because the majority of people will never get a diagnosis, let alone access to the treatment that might support them. So we don't need to worry too much about diagnosis, but we might be aware that somebody perhaps does have a diagnosis or is presenting with mental ill health that is really affecting their life on a consistent basis. So impact, severity, and time are the main key things behind what makes something a kind of difficulty versus a condition. So severity, length of time, impact on daily life, and the severity, how, whether it, how severe your low mood is, for example. And there are all sorts of tests that a GP typically would be the person to do, or maybe it's more mental health, psychologists or other practitioners. But that needs to be done by a professional, if it's to be done at all. And I'm never saying that someone needs a diagnosis. Quadrant 4, a person with a diagnosis of a serious mental illness, but who copes well and who has positive mental health. I'm going to let this just kind of like register. I consider myself in quadrant 4. I've got a range of mental health conditions which will often bob their heads up, but I feel like I'm thriving in my life. So what is it that helps us be in quadrant 4? It might be access to good treatment, a good support network. It might be a diagnosis. It might be understanding and accepting diagnoses. It might be access to good medication. And I mentioned, I came off medication, but don't get me wrong, it can be crucial in terms of getting into quadrant 4 for certain people. But it's also about having stability, access to things that give us a sense of purpose and mission. And when we have a dispute on our hands, those fundamental things can be at stake. So one of the ways that we can help someone with mental health get above that horizontal axis is by helping them access what they need to thrive, to have those 5 ways to well-being in their life. And as more and more people in high profile positions disclose diagnoses like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, we're starting to understand that you can live really well and have complex responsibility in your life and have a really complex mental health condition. It comes down to us understanding, feeling supported, and having, including having a sense of what we would do in crisis moments as well. So, some risk factors for poor mental health. I don't think any of these will cause you, will be a surprise. And I won't go through them all, you've got the slides, but just to note that it can be individual aspects and it can be societal aspects. And if we flip many of these over, then what we've got are protective factors. And I want to underline that often these factors are, they're not in our gift to have, determined. And for somebody who was, I speak for myself, dependent on benefits for 2 years, I want to underline how brutal austerity Britain is, how deeply uncaring it is, how much it kind of seeks to suffocate people who can't fend for themselves. So even just the financial instability that someone might have because their mental health or their work conditions might mean that they can't access work is enough to really affect poor mental health. Back to the chicken and egg. So let's ask ourselves, how might a person think or feel, behave in mediation, depending on which quadrant they're in? I'd like to invite you to share in the chat box, how do we know in mediation if someone, I'm going to put it in quadrant 1, that someone is in quadrant 1? What are they, and invite everyone to just pop some thoughts in. What are we seeing? What are the signs and symptoms, as it were, that someone's doing okay, that they're thriving and they're flourishing and they're feeling comfortable, as comfortable as they could do within mediation? So I'll just read some out as they come. Sometimes it takes a while for them to register. And when you've done that, you might start, but don't put them in yet, start to have a think about what are you noticing about a client who might be in quadrant 2. So I can't see any coming through yet. That might be because you're shy or because it sometimes takes a while to come through. Oh, they're coming through. Great. Okay. So in quadrant 1, they're energized. They've got confidence in saying how they feel. People can move back and forth through these quadrants. It's not black and white. There's a myriad of shades of gray moving back and forth through the quadrants. Thanks so much, Sarah. Yeah. And that can be across a meeting, across a day. The fact is that it's a dynamic continuum, that we see open communication. They're bright and good humored, even under the sort of challenges of the mediation. Some people can really sort of feel buoyed by it. They're optimistic. They're engaging with the facts as they're presented. The questions they ask show they're understanding issues or able to admit what they don't understand. The mediator feels reassured they're able to self-determine. Lovely, thank you. They seem grounded, speaking in a rational way. Thanks, Chelsea. They're connected and can talk about positive experiences as well as the challenges. They can see things from another perspective, and they're more able to compromise and collaborate. And they're listening, able to process what they hear and communicating their feelings. Thank you so much. So what about quadrant 2? What are we seeing for a party who we think is struggling, is not thriving, is having difficulty with the process, with being in that space? How do we know that they are basically, that they're exhibiting sort of lower mental well-being and fitness? So they may be despondent. Thank you. It shows in their body language. Yeah. They may be tearful. Yeah. And the thing about tears I love is that sometimes tears can be a sign that we're in a really good state. Like, if you're able to process your emotions and cry them out, that can be a really good thing. But equally, on the other side, it can be a sign that it's just too much. Chronically stuck, often with the conflicts past, finding it very difficult to consider the future. They can't see how mediation could help. They seem to repeat the same story continuously without seeming to be affected from what is shared by others. They're expressing perhaps paranoid feelings. The other person is out to get me. Yes, thank you. Sometimes repetitive narrative that reinforces the negative feelings. Having difficulty making eye contact, feels shut down, hesitant to speak, having trouble tracking the conversation. They may have retreated and be reluctant to speak, finding it difficult to engage with any services, and there may be blame at play. So I just want to hold a moment of real compassion, because often when we are in that state, it doesn't trigger sort of empathy from others, it triggers frustration. So our signs and symptoms that this is all too much triggers more negative behavior from other people. So that's a tough place for us to be, but it's also a tough place for a mediator, because it's so, if someone's in quadrant 1, things flow and we feel good that we're able to help more readily. So hopefully in the next few little bits, we'll talk about how you can support someone in that when they're in that moment, and how your presence and just your listening is so valuable. Let's just touch base on that important question. Some of you mentioned red flags. And I've just got red traffic light here. For me, this is, what might we be seeing that would make us think that mediation needed to pause? Either the whole process, or a joint meeting, or even a private meeting. What are we seeing in the client that would make us think, okay, we need to recalibrate, we need to take a step back? Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so voicing suicidal ideation, bleak and hopeless comments. And I'm going to touch very lightly on this later, but really I will recommend some really good online training you can do to feel confident around this topic. It's too big a topic for me to do within this, but I've got something great to recommend you. The client is presenting with significant thoughts of self-harm. The participants becoming agitated, they're in fight mode, there's significant distress, difficulty engaging with issues. So the mediator can't be confident. The client is able to consider options to resolve the dispute. Thank you, yes. Exhibiting symptoms outside the window of tolerance. Yes, hyperventilating or extreme shutdown, and physical indicators such as hives or shaking. So again, just to really hold compassion if someone is in this state, so important for us not to panic ourselves, but just to be with them and to acknowledge that the process might need to shift, and we need to maybe just kind of rethink and stop, and make sure that there is some support there. So yes, as Sarah says, lack of support network, they're isolated and don't have anyone to turn to, no one to vent to. So I'm really interested, and I think in community mediation, we kind of tread this very gentle kind of line between mediation and advocacy. We really do, we're clear that we're not advocates, but there are certain things we can do from our local knowledge to help ensure people maybe start to take the steps to have the right support in place. Often, for those of us experiencing mental health, we can become very frozen, and the support of a sympathetic person who makes it okay for us to, for example, call Mind or access a service can be a real key turner. We're not going to talk a huge amount about stigma here, but stigma is the cause of a huge amount of discrimination, but equally self-stigma. We can really internalize thoughts that we've heard around mental health, and that can prevent us from seeking help. So thank you so much for your thoughts there. Let's go to key message number 3. The mediation process is pre-designed to be accessible to people with mental health conditions. And I might ask you just to put in the chat box your thoughts. I'll carry on with the slides, but you can share amongst you, because I'm just going to look at a few things. So principally, a really important factor is that mediators create psychologically safe environments. So within a psychologically safe environment, I'll just start on the green loop. There's a comfort around admitting mistakes. There's a comfort in learning from failure. People openly share ideas, and there's more innovation and decision making. That's from the fearless organization. But if we apply how, when we've got the right atmosphere in a joint meeting, people do get into that place where they are able to acknowledge maybe things that they wish they'd done better, or they are able to start brainstorming and to start thinking about the future. That's an indication that you have created a psychologically safe environment. When we don't, and many of us who do workplace mediation will have, be brought in when perhaps the manager has brought a couple of people together to talk it out and then just let them tear at each other in front of each other without intervening, for example. That's an example of of creating a space of psychological danger. So psychological safety can often be achieved by careful deployment of the normal protocols of mediation, including no interrupting or speaking over each other, those ground rules, taking breaks if emotions are heightened, upholding respect for people's views, a thoughtful seating arrangement to reduce a sense of threat, and clarifying the scope, agenda, and agreed outcomes of the mediation at intervals. We may also wish to bring enhanced flexibility to our mediation process to create even more psychological safety by extending initial private meetings to develop that trust and rapport, increasing the number of breaks in joint meetings to check in with parties and give rest time, shifting from whole day mediations to 2 half-day mediations over a few weeks, just sort of giving time. I think really many of us have shifted away from whole day now that online is so available. And invite parties to bring supporters, as long as everyone is in agreement and there's an equilibrium around who is present and a discussion around who is present, and the role of the supporter is clear, then that can make all the difference. So there's a great article from Dan Bernstein on mediate.com around helping parties with disabilities without discriminating. So he himself has bipolar disorder. And he says, generally speaking, I'm able to get all of my needs met in mediation without ever having to link it to my mental illness, because mediators emphasize self-determination throughout the process. Therefore, they follow my wishes to adjust the mediation in many ways with just my asking for the change without my ever needing to share my bipolar disorder diagnosis. But say I found a mediator who said philosophically they would never caucus or go into private meetings, and yet I believed caucusing was a necessary buffer because of the symptoms from my mood disorder. I could then ask the mediator for a change in that policy through making a reasonable accommodation request. And in the UK, we call it reasonable adjustments, and we'll touch on this in a sec. And we would discuss that adjustment. Again, I would only have to do that if they were not flexible in the first place. So Dan Bernstein talks about ways that, we can actually unintentionally convey some microaggressions, those subtle and indirect behaviors or interactions that might show bias towards someone with mental health. And I think it's, he pulls no punches, but I think it's helpful just to be clear about this. So we might, he talks about people minimizing disability experience. Oh, we all have some kind of disability. We're all anxious from time to time. That sort of comment, which many of us will have heard. Denial of privacy, asking what happened either directly or by fishing through it through indirect means. And I think there is value in questions. So it's not about not asking, but it is about respecting privacy. Assumed helplessness. And this is a big one when there's a referrer saying, yeah, they've got some mental health difficulties, suggesting the need to engage an expert or outside referral because of the person's confusing or overwhelming needs. And then a tough one, but infantilization, treating people with the premise that they're not able to do things themselves or have less agency, like a child, the kind of let me do that for you approach. So that's Those are common disability microaggressions. And what we want to make sure that we're doing is just stepping away from any unconscious bias that because someone maybe has mental health difficulties, that they can't fully participate. So number 4, it helps to keep the brain in mind. So here's my lay neuropsychology for you. But actually, having said that, I've read a huge amount on neuropsychology and neuroplasticity, and it's probably been the key thing in helping me learn how to manage my mental health. So here's your brilliant brain, and it is fully wired to detect threat. And thank goodness, because if it didn't, then we would have been wiped out by the saber-toothed tigers a long time ago. So typically we sense threat through a visual cortex, and that triggers the red hot button called the amygdala in our limbic system, which sets off a whole range of behavioral and physiological responses. Fight or flight. That is the shaking, the blood is all running to our, rushing to our heart and to our muscles. We're taking in breath so that we can run. We're expecting either to be able to leg it away from the threat or to fight our way. And that is why we see people in a very heightened state when they are feeling threatened. And of course, they may well feel threatened in, for example, a joint meeting, coming face to face with someone that's been a cause of a huge amount of difficulty. So modern day amygdala really is not very advanced. Yes, it will help us respond if a car is coming, but it will also treat a neighbor, a deadline, an unwelcome relationship in the same way. And that is really the basis for a lot of our anxiety. Now, long-term anxiety is what becomes an anxiety disorder. This is really, kind of quite basic, but this is where a lot of this comes from. Now, a difficulty is when we are in what I would call an amygdala state, a special message, a fear message goes to your prefrontal cortex. And this is what it says. Prefrontal cortex, we've got an emergency. We do not need you with your new sophisticated modern ways of decision-making and executive functioning, or being polite, or speaking according to our social mores. We're going to fight or flee. But of course, what we need for someone to be able to resolve their dispute is for them to have access to the prefrontal cortex. So what does that mean, and what are we working with? Well, we're working with the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has 2 modes. It cannot be in both at once. It's either in the sympathetic fight or flight state, running away, or it's in the parasympathetic rest and digest, tend and befriend state. You've got this image here of someone having a nap, but many of us can sleep in fight or flight. Think about those really restless nights. So actually getting into the parasympathetic state is a practice. And that is why I would encourage us to be talking about self-care with our clients. Is there anything you can do to look after yourself? Encourage people to do the 5 ways to well-being, because that's how we get into the parasympathetic state. There's a brilliant book called Burnout, which talks about the stress response cycle and how we need to close off stress. There's another great author called Paul Gilbert, who you might like to look up to understand a bit more. He talks about us having 3 emotional regulation systems: the threat system, which is driven by adrenaline and cortisol, and the drive system, driven by dopamine, that reward, and also serotonin when we feel in good standing with our social peers. And in a sense, do you remember, we could say that quadrant 1, we're in the blue state, quadrant 2, we're kind of in the red state. But the system that is least talked about is the soothing system. And that is where we kind of download the opiates and the oxytocin. Now, people who grew up with, those of us who grew up with complex attachment in our childhood or have had traumatic events, we're less likely to be able to access our soothing system. Now, what we do know about all of this work around the autonomic nervous system, and you might be interested in polyvagal theory as another thing to follow if you're interested, is that there is the factor of co-regulation. So if I am in a tense state and I come into contact with someone who is accessing their parasympathetic state, who has got, has practiced their soothing system, then I might well co-regulate to them. So having a sense of how you are in that meeting and allowing that person just to co-regulate to your confident state is part of what you're offering someone, particularly in a one-to-one. I love the work of David Rock. He has this great book called Your Brain at Work. And he says that in terms of the brain flicking into, sort of away and toward, there are 5 really important things. He calls them the SCAR factors, and they're status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And think how many of our cases people were really cross or in dispute or despairing because their status has been threatened, or the other party was making life very uncertain, or they'd had their autonomy withdrawn, or they didn't feel they could relate, or they didn't think things were fair. So in terms of what we're looking at in our resolutions, some of the brain-friendly solutions will come around these SCAR factors. It's not to kind of like lever them in, but for us to be aware that someone may not be able to articulate why they're so furious, but it might be to do with status or certainty or autonomy, relatedness, or fairness. So how can a mediator support strong emotions like fear, combativeness, or distress that come out of us being in that fight or flight? Invite the person to take a break, get up and move the body. The psoas muscle can really trap a lot of trauma. So we want to encourage movement. Name the emotions and with the person and validate their emotions. You can coach individuals to, excuse my typo, to express their feelings and needs. I think the work of nonviolent communication is invaluable there. If someone is withdrawn, avoidant, or frozen, again, take a break and move around. We can be present, confident, and relaxed, modeling that soothing, undertaking some further one-to-one work, and do some further work with the other party. Quite often, the other party may well be triggering some response in the party who is perhaps experiencing more vulnerability at that moment. There are some really gentle things we can do to help the other party meet some of the needs of the person without disclosing anything. Focus on the what now and what next can be very clarifying. We start to globalize things when we're in that amygdala state. So this is what we'll do now, and this is what we'll do next can help. And we can get visual using a flip chart or a screen share just to focus the attention on where we're at that present moment. The mind can bring a lot of kind of distorted thoughts sometimes that kind of back up fear. And when someone is in a really difficult state, I really recommend this book, How to Listen, produced by the Samaritans, on how they listen within the Samaritans. And I just got my pre-ordered book, Listen by Catherine Mannix, How to Find the Words for Tender Conversations. So she's a palliative care consultant, or was. So we want to find our own style, but just helping someone maybe kind of flowchart their way around what they can do at this moment and focus their attention there. For many of us who are perhaps prone to anxiety or very low mood, that can help to mobilize part of us. Number 5 of my key messages is that it's okay to ask. So let's clarify this. Back to Dan Bernstein, he says in a mediation, it may be as simple as saying, my job as your mediator is to make sure this process works for you. A key value is self-determination, which means the process is voluntary and you can make all of the choices. Is there anything you want or need to make this process more comfortable for you? I can be flexible. So the power of the words, I can be flexible. Can a mediator ask a person about their mental health? So I I'm really keen to make that distinction between, where Dan Bernstein is, that says, just almost, I think he's saying, treat everyone the same. But for me, these are questions I would put to any individual in private sessions, because I think checking in on mental well-being is a key part of us being able to provide a good service. So would you feel comfortable telling me about your mental well-being at this time? Allows them to say, actually, I'd rather not talk about it. Has this conflict contributed negatively to your current well-being in any ways you would like me to be aware of? Or are you aware of possible external sources of emotional support you could access? Or is there any aspect of your medical care you would like for me to know about? That might be things like someone has a medication that makes it very hard for them to function in the mornings, and therefore it will be really valuable for us to have meetings in the afternoon. Or are there any changes we could make to the mediation process that would make it easier for you to feel at ease? Now, there are sort of pros and cons to knowing in advance about a party's mental health condition if they have one. If it is disclosed, it might be about pacing the mediation, exploring adjustments, having more frequent breaks, anticipating emotions and welcoming them when they arise. Emotional expression is better understood and mitigated in those moments. And we can have conversations about safeguarding or boundaries of mediator confidentiality. So letting the person know, as we always do, if we have any concerns, we'll want to share it with someone else, and maybe clarifying who that is with, and inviting supporters to be involved. Problems associated with knowing in advance about a party's mental health condition may include unconscious bias, or assuming that the mental ill health is the root of the conflict, or it might make us self-conscious. So overall, I say it's valuable to talk directly and openly with a person, but never force or encourage fishing, as Dan Bernstein says, anyone to disclose anything that they're not comfortable to share. Just open an invitation. So let's touch on the Equality Act now, and I put this under building mentally healthy workplaces and practices. So in terms of disability, a mental health condition may or may not be considered a mental disability under the Equality Act. It comes down to a disability is defined as a condition that has a significant impact on someone's ability to carry out the normal day-to-day activities of life, including work, and has lasted or may last 12 months or more. So the average episode of depression is 6 to 8 months. So we don't know in month 2 after a diagnosis whether this will last 12 months. So what we want to do is say, well, we want to act as the Equality Act would suggest we act to meet that person's needs. And what the Equality Act says is that we should make reasonable adjustments to make it easier for the person to either to access our mediation, but for those of you doing workplace mediation, it's helpful for you to know that really what you might be talking about in a mediation that is involving an employee with mental ill health, it might be looking at reasonable adjustments or on the journey towards. It is not for us, for the mediation, to discern what the reasonable adjustment should be. That comes down to an occupational health or a doctor. I also want to underline that any of these protected characteristics under the Equality Act, all of these are featured because someone might be more at risk of discrimination, oppression, or marginalization. So just having that awareness and being very aware of diversity will help us have a better practice. So reasonable adjustments are boundaried, empowering to the employee, time limited, agreed with the employee in the employee's interests, specific, operationally possible, and affordable. So we've got much more information in this brilliant resource. This is one of the things I'm really happy to be able to make sure everyone can access through the slides. It's hyperlinked. The Mental Health First Aid Line Managers resource. Really valuable for you to understand the Equality Act better, but also for workplace mediations. I really recommend wellness action plans. They are provided by Mind, and some organizations use them across the whole organization. asking everyone to fill them in, but they're particularly designed for employees with mental health difficulties to fill in for themselves. And basically, they're a set of really good questions that actually can be very helpful for us to think about asking a client, whether it's workplace mediation or not. It's things like, what is helpful for you to keep your well-being in good stead, or are there things that you would like adjusted that would make it easier for you to work? So these are the kind of exploratory questions that we're often using with parties, whether it's workplace or community. It's really what meets your needs. Should a mediator be drawn into making an internal diagnosis of a mental health condition? Well, as I've mentioned, most people won't be diagnosed. So we don't need to know about diagnoses, but there are a couple of areas where it's important for us to pause and reflect carefully on our concerns and consider seeking professional input or going back to the referrer to share those concerns. So if someone is experiencing acute cognitive distortions, hallucinations, and delusions, they may be experiencing symptoms of psychosis, and they will need professional support, full stop, but also certainly in order to access mediation. And if you sense or see that the person is at risk of harming themselves or others, or is expressing suicidal thoughts, perhaps by expressing hopelessness, despair, or helplessness. So here is the online training. It's zerosuicidealliance.com. It's 20 to 60 minutes. And I just think it's really excellent work. So if you do feel someone is at a crisis, first stay calm, and you can ask them directly. For example, are you having thoughts of harming yourself? Don't be afraid to talk about it if the person does disclose. Just remain present and allow them to share what they can. If appropriate, and if you're able to, stay with the person, but you really need to seek help from others and get the person professional help. We're certainly never, of course, offering not to tell anyone. You can call 999 if you think there's immediate risk, or 111 if less urgent. And do let people know about the Samaritans. And equally, that's for us if we've had a very distressing conversation. So further recommended resources would be Mind, Mental Health at Work, and 1U. Mental Health at Work is a repository of all things to do with mental health in the workplace that's useful for us as mediators, full stop, or workplace mediators. 1U is an NHS resource with lots on how to look after yourself. So scooting into the end, and I might go over by a minute or so, I apologize, but I've just got a couple, I think one more slide after this. 6, put your own oxygen mask on first. So supporting people who are in distress can be distressing. So what can we do to look after our own well-being? Well, we can use the 5 ways to well-being, put them in our diaries. Don't kind of like wait till we're in crisis, but make sure they're regularly there, connecting with other people, going for a walk. Supervision, mentoring, and reflective practice groups are really valuable. Think about having a co-mediator or an assistant mediator who can provide emotional support. Keep those strong, clear professional boundaries. Remember to rest and unwind, and have built-in routines of self-care, especially after mediation days. So that brings me to the end of the session. Thank you so very much for being here. It's 5:30 exactly, so I will stay on for if anyone's got any questions, and I can see one in the chat box, but thank you very much, everyone. I will just stop recording.